back, everyone, to another episode of Are You Ready with Joanne Molinaro, where we talk about how to get ready to live a more purposeful and empowered life. This week, I'd like to introduce you to a real live artist, one who doesn't use ChatGPT or AI tools to create his work. Nope, he uses his hands and sometimes a little acetate. His name is David Molinaro, and as you can probably tell, yeah, we're related. David is, in fact, my brother-in-law. Aha, you might be saying, makes total sense. These Molinaro kids got the lion's share when God was doling out talents. And you might be onto something. But what I soon discovered after talking with David for, 60 seconds, is that there is a great deal of truth in the phrase, art imitates life. I challenge all of you to listen to just even the first 10 minutes and not find at least 10 different ways that David's discussion of his process is the exact same process by which all of us should endeavor to approach life's challenges, starting a business, building a fitness routine, even building a better relationship. Today's discussion, it covers a lot of ground. David takes us through his artistic process from vision to execution, but also chats about how he decided to pursue art at all, something I personally find endlessly fascinating, having pursued a very not artistic career. But perhaps the most interesting part about our conversation is what doesn't get said, what David intentionally leaves on the table, recognizing that some things, they can't be brought to life through words, and therefore, they're better left unsaid. I'm curious to hear whether you all pick up on that as much as I did while talking with him, and what impact that has on you. Thank you so much for letting us crash your beautiful studio.
Awesome. Great to have you here.
Yeah, it is really extraordinary looking in here. I know for people who are just listening, you can't see, although we'll be including some footage of your studio, but I can see why you spend so much time here. On top of the fact that it takes you several hours to do just the work that you do.
Yeah, in weeks.
Yeah, you had mentioned when you gave us a tour of this place that just one commission can take anywhere from 2 to 3 months.
Yeah. 8 to 12 weeks with some, gives me some cushion time.
So I wanted to ask you, what's your favorite thing about being an artist?
The fact that you're making something from nothing is probably the most joy you get out of it. Then when you see other people react to it, that really just is kind of the icing on the cake. The other thing is just when you're doing it, it's just a very cool feeling.
And when you say when you're doing it, what is your main medium, if you will?
My main medium that brings me income is oil painting. It's actually one of my favorite mediums. It's kind of the most complicated, I think. I mean that you can argue that watercolors is kind of up there too. There's very similar personalities in how you can handle the medium. From the substrate you use, how much water you use in terms of watercolors. But oil paints are very similar in that way. You can go straight up realistic with them, or you can beat them up however you want, manipulate them. They have a mind of their own, so you have to just kind of learn where it's going, and you got to go with them, kind of thing. And that's what I like about them. Similar to like wine, the wine, an aged wine is not the same 20 years earlier than it is later. It kind of has a mind of its own through its process. Oils are very similar that way.
You mentioned that one of the other things that you love so much about being an artist is the feeling that you get when you're creating something, like you said, from nothing to something. Can you describe a little bit what that feeling is like?
When you start something, and even if it exists, we'll take the flag for example. When you start painting that, it's something that everybody already can relate to. But when I start painting and putting layer onto layer, it just starts to become my own. My personality is coming out of there, and I think that's what I enjoy the most. Now, it doesn't even have to be a flag. When I do something completely abstract, that same personality is coming out. You can take something completely abstract and something that people can identify with, and they're going to see probably my personality. They'll see the similarities in what I'm talking about, and I like that. But that happens during the process. I can't just say to you, I do this and I do that. The part that kind of feels really cool is when you're doing it. And there's like a question and answer phase almost while you're in that process. So you have to be in the process to even get to that. And it's kind of like, am I going to make a mistake or not? You have to just put paint on there and go with it. And that's what's super cool about it.
It's exciting, but also to me, as the risk-averse person, it sounds terrifying.
Well, it can be a little. It can be a little terrifying, and often I may find myself procrastinating. That's how I know that's the reason I like it, because when I get out of that procrastination phase, and just put paint on a canvas, which sometimes I have to do, just to get out of it, you find yourself then going into that question and answer phase. Well, why did I put this red here? What am I going to do with this red? So just throw another color on there. Now those two colors mix. Throw a chemical on there. Now there's a chemical on, that's doing something. That's gelling those colors together. And then you just like, what do I like about this? What do I dislike about it? What would I add to it that might make me feel a little better? And that's just all part of the process. But you have to start really to kind of get that cool feeling that I enjoy.
I think that's the hardest part, though, for a lot of people, whether it's in art or some other creative or even non-creative endeavor, is just starting.
Yeah, for sure. But when you do, and again, you may get to a point, like even if you do start, you may get somewhere where you're like, I don't like it. So then you let it dry, and it could sit. I've had some sit in my studios for years. And then I go back to them. I either cover them up with something else, or I may see something that I liked, and I'm like, oh, that reminds me of that piece I started a while ago, and I'll go back to it. Now, on stuff that's where there's deadlines, well, then you have to start. You have to start, and you have to get yourself into that process. And the more you do it, obviously, the more you know what's going to happen, and maybe the more you realize what you're going to make. On some of the complete abstract pieces, that's which I get some of the most joy out of, because that's just something I'm going to make from my own brain. But even on the stuff that people may ask me, hey, I really like this one piece, can you do it in this color? I pretty much then know what's going to happen and how I'm going to approach it. But there's no question, just starting can be a pretty daunting task, even for somebody who does it almost every day, for sure.
I feel like it's such a great, I always say this, but running is such a great analogy for everything. But I feel like, just like what you said, even for someone who runs every day, sometimes the hardest part of every single run is just stepping out the door.
For sure. No doubt about that. When you take X amount of time off from running, it is going out of the door. Or any exercise metaphor works in this scenario. The gym, if I take X amount of time, sometimes just going to the gym, that's the workout. And then I actually have put a 5-minute rule like in my head when I get locked up in situations like that. And that may apply to painting. However, getting prepped for painting takes a while. But in terms of like exercise, I'm just going to go and do 5 minutes. And then I end up finding out that I'm going to do 20 or 30 or 40. Painting is like, if I just squeeze a tube of paint onto one of those trowels, well, I'm not going to leave it there, so I better find somewhere to put it at. And then I find myself half an hour, a couple hours later maybe, just playing around. So for sure, there's a lot of analogies that can be applied to exercise, and painting is no different.
So now I have to ask you the flip question. What is your least favorite thing about being an artist?
Oh, yeah, deadlines, for sure. But without them, sometimes I wouldn't get to that starting phase. That seems obvious, deadlines. Sometimes when the paint's not reacting the way I want it to, or I want it to get somewhere quicker, that's probably what I don't like. And then when it's not going somewhere as fast as I'd like it to be, and there's deadlines, then you're like, oh, come on. Actually, another bad thing about it is you have a vision in your brain, and I know I'll get there, and when it takes if it takes longer to get there, or when you first start, you're like, oh yeah, I had this thought, and it didn't come out that way, and you spent 2, 3, 4 hours, and you're like, oh, what am I going to do now? So sometimes you have to, walk away and come back the next day. And again, I usually find then it comes out even a little better because you've now added a layer of something that you didn't really like yesterday, but tomorrow or the next day, you then went on top of that, worked with what you didn't like yesterday, and then you end up liking today. Now, it doesn't necessarily happen overnight all the time. It could be a week later, but then you could see that underlying structure of where you're maybe struggling, and you're like, yeah, actually that worked out. And that ends up then going back to that process. You have to just kind of get in there, and you have to go with those ups and downs because you're going to have them.
Have you ever gotten to a point where you've been working not even just for a couple hours, but for a couple of days, and you wake up in the morning and you see how it's turned out, and you're like, oh no, this is all sorts of wrong. I'm going to have to start from scratch.
Yeah, well, I rarely start from scratch with oil paintings. I just figure I'm going to give it a couple days, maybe, let everything dry, and I could always just kind of go over things. But there's no doubt I probably go through that phase. Never where I've just dumped something. I usually just stop and just give it a rest, but I've never just, maybe on like smaller illustrations it's easier to do that, but on the oil paintings I just feel like you gotta keep on going.
Muscle through it.
Yeah, because what end up happening, if it's not for someone and it's just for me, there's not always a direct vision to the finish line. So it's one of those things is like just jump back in and see what you make today out of what you didn't like last week or yesterday kind of thing, and see what you come up with. And if you keep on going, usually you start landing on little things that you like, start to kind of create themselves, and then you run with that direction. So that's, for painting, I think that's probably the best way to go. Now, maybe if you're doing a realistic, portrait, that might be a little different because you're like, oh, but this doesn't really look like that person. But if you're doing it for yourself, then that's just called practice. So keep on practicing.
As I said, David's philosophy on art is truly a masterclass on life. And in life, they often say that practice makes perfect, but as I'm sure we've all discovered, this aphorism doesn't always hold true. Sometimes practice, and even more practice, doesn't always pan out the way we envisioned. And sometimes our vision for ourselves becomes more stressful than anything the world could demand from us. So I asked David how he handles the pressure of his own vision, how he manages his own expectations from himself by using one of his most popular paintings as an example. This painting, it's the one of his Aunt Menica mowing the lawn while wearing a picture-perfect Sunday frock and heels. Tell us about these two, because I love this piece by you. This is one of my favorite pieces by you of all time. And then it looks like there's a photograph upon which this was inspired, or by, that inspired this piece?
Yeah, very popular piece. In fact, people have offered me some pretty good money. I haven't been able to part with it. This is my aunt, Zia Menica. This photo is at my grandmother's on the east side of Chicago. Now, Zia Menica, as you know, lives in Italy. And I have circa 1959 on here, but we couldn't get an exact date of this photo. But this is a great photo of my aunt mowing the lawn when she came. When she came to visit my grandmother, and she's just got this awesome flower dress on, the push mower, and the heels. So I sat with this photo for so long, and I'm like, I gotta make a piece of art out of this. I didn't quite know how to do it. So I just started drawing it as a pen, just a pen and ink, not realistically. then I think I saw a particular piece from Andy Warhol actually that had a really huge field of color, and then one really small Marilyn Monroe head. And I was like, okay, I think I have an idea. So I drew her with pen and ink by hand, but then I brought her into the computer, and I turned her into what they call like a vector graphic. And that's one of the trials. And the reason I did that is I wanted to get these kind of stripes you can kind of see in the background.
Yeah.
So this particular piece ended up being created, it was created by hand, then brought into the computer, and then I've added this little photo border. And this process here is the same thing as that Chicago Gangster piece for MTV. This is a piece of film on top of an acrylic background. So this is a canvas, this is painted acrylic. And then I shellacked that piece of film, and that piece of film had the stripes printed on them. And I knew that the pink on top of the orange would just be a subtle thing when you would get up close to it, when the glue would dry. And then when that all dried, I then went back on top and added the yellow and brought out the pink flowers, and just enough hint to bring out the mower, and of course her pumps, which just makes that piece. And, this is definitely a favorite of mine for sure.
And there's so much whimsy in this one. I mean, there's obviously a great deal of whimsy in the original photograph. Whoever took the photograph knew what they were doing too. But I think even what you talk about, putting it on the vector graph, adding the subtle pink stripes to this, and then of course turning those shoes a bright, almost cartoonish blue.
Yeah.
I think that is...
I mean, you could, I'll actually take this off the wall so you can see, but I had practiced so long, you can just see.
Oh my gosh!
You can see the film.
Yeah!
Trying to make sure I would get it right.
Oh wow, that's so cool.
And directly behind you is one that went wrong, actually, but still looks cool. And it only went wrong because, see, the white stuff is the glue that didn't dry. So I was getting very nervous about it.
So you practiced before?
Oh, I practiced. I have all kinds of these. Yeah, because I needed it to dry like that.
Real subtle.
So when I got like 10 of them down, that I was like, okay, here we go.
Here we go. Yeah. Oh, it looks beautiful. Looks amazing. I've seen now evidence of how much practice you put into a given piece. For example, that beautiful one of your Zia Menica, and you were trying to create a very specific effect with the acrylic lines, and you showed us earlier, here I practiced here. This one didn't turn out, the way I wanted it, but I ended up keeping it because I really liked the effect that it ultimately produced. But what I find so incredible is, for me, the first time I tried it, if it didn't come out exactly the way that I had in my mind, there's probably a 50% chance that I would just say, I'm quitting. I don't want to do this anymore. I got to figure out something else, or this vision is not achievable. I can't do it. I have to scrap this altogether and just find some other way of doing it. But it sounds to me that whether it's just trusting the process, trusting yourself, or having done this so many times, you're actually okay with, it sounds like several iterations before you achieve your vision.
I am, but that one I was really nervous about because I did have a direct vision. I was going through a process, and then my vision kind of created itself. And then I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to make. Now, I then had to, because it involved a process that I was at 60% sure that it was going to go through. I needed to get myself to 90. I never really got close to 100. I got to the point where it was like, okay, this is the time to do it. And there was a lot of pacing, right? There was a lot of that procrastination pacing going up and down the hallway of, when am I going to transfer the image onto the canvas? Because I already spent time painting the canvas, the background color that I wanted to achieve. Now, of course, I could have done it again, but I really didn't want to. So yes, there was X amount of iterations, probably 20 times of doing the transfer. And when the last 5 came out clear, or the way I wanted it to come out, right, I then just said, okay, this is the time. And just went at it. And I knew right away that it was kind of working out. And yeah, thank God that one came out. That's a perfect scenario where I was pretty nervous because I did have that direct vision, and that's not like an oil painting. Where the drips of paint are part of my style, and I could just paint over it. On that one, it was very clean craft, right? There was a background, then a foreground that needed to be clean.
So there was no room for error.
There was no room for error on that one, which is why I cherish it so much, and the fact that it happens to be such an awesome image of my aunt. And now I've, put her in a legacy image, and it's very pop culture, even, so.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's definitely one of my favorite pieces. But 20 iterations. Let's assume that it is in fact 20. Would you consider versions 1 through 19 failures then?
No, because in fact the light bulb went off on number 1, where I was like, oh yeah, this is fucking cool, and maybe even 2. It was like on number 3 or 4 where it wasn't coming out completely clear, and then even on 5 and 6 wasn't as clear. I was getting bubbles into the transfer, and I didn't want that. So yeah, so then I would take small versions of it and stack her up, right? So there'd be like 3 of her, and then I would just cut each one separately and have a larger canvas and just try each one. And then it was like the last 5, I think, were coming out clean. I had the kind of paper I was using, the printer that I was using to make the transfer. The sink and water was all ready to go. So I knew that was going to be it. And if it didn't work out, then I probably would have taken a week or so, or 2 weeks off, and just went back at it again, because I knew I wanted to make this piece. So.
And it sounds like you were learning how not to do it with every single version. I mean, it sounds like versions 1 and 2 might have been the inspiration, but by 3, 4, 5, and certainly by 17 and 18, you're like, all right, well, this is not exactly what I want, so I need to tweak this here, learn from whatever I did here in order to achieve what I think is the perfect result.
Yeah, for sure. And, not a lot of people will understand what I'm talking about when I talk about these transfers, but paper ended up being a big part of it. So I was using certain photographic paper. So once I found the one that was where I could put the film on that paper and then soak that paper in the water, and then that film would just kind of slide off, then I had found my process.
And that sliding off, the film sliding off, you kind of talked about this while you were showing us some of your other work. I mean, that was a methodology that you developed like several years ago, it sounds like, with an earlier project, correct?
Yeah, for the MTV Real World, that wasn't a glossy paper. In fact, that was a really matte, toothy finish, and that's why it took hours to scrub the paper off. And that's when I realized I'm not doing that again. So, because that paper was just getting so, yeah. I think I did try the piece with my aunt once on that, and then I switched over to photographic paper. But then I again switched over to cheaper photographic paper, because the expensive photographic paper has a coating on it, and that didn't want to take the ink off, because the ink gets so trapped into the paper. So when I went to the cheap inkjet print paper, photo paper, right, then I found when I put that in water, the film just kind of peeled right off. Anyways, this was a piece, commission piece. There was about 10 other pieces as well, but this was the main one for MTV. It was the first time MTV Real World was coming to Chicago, and they wanted to have Chicago icons. So hence Al Capone being the main character, but Chicago Gangsters were kind of a part of this theme. This is typical graphic design and hardcore printing at its best, because back then inkjet printers didn't go very, very large. First, I needed to come up with a composition as a graphic designer that I liked. So I did that on the computer, but because these are very, very old newspaper clippings, they wouldn't reproduce at 4 feet or 5 feet.
Yeah.
And at that same time, there weren't that many people doing large scale printing at the same time. So this is a process that I would do in Photoshop where you would take that small photo and then I'd create what they call these bitmap halftones, and you could add whatever resolution
so that
you
it
want,
looks
so that,
crisp.
Yeah, and at the same time, it looks cool. It looks, it looks like a screen print. It looks like something, Warhol would do. But this particular piece is not really a printout. It's actually a piece of film from a printout. And there's a seam here because the printer couldn't go that big at the time. So it was 2 printouts. And in fact, I gave MTV an actual full print. This print I took back to my studio and I put this acrylic gel on it. And I have that over there, but you put this acrylic gel and then you soak it in water and then you scrub the paper off and you're left with a piece of film. And then I shellacked it onto a canvas and that gel dries opaque.
Looks amazing.
So it's actually a piece of film and not a printout. And the tears, I think, all just add to it.
You leaned into the tears instead of trying to hide them.
Yeah, that's part of it. So that's why I kept this piece and gave MTV an actual print, because now you could print this out anywhere, but it's not the same.
Well, you mentioned that this is like something that Warhol would do, and I've seen a lot of people attempting to do kind of this amalgam of pop culture and refined art. But one of the things that I love about this piece is that it is exactly that. It's a great kind of statement about pop culture, at least at that time, especially given the fact that it was for the real world, for MTV, which is kind of an icon of pop culture. But to do it in this very understated, beautiful way, and then also to hear the story about how, hey, I was basically living with my roommates and shellacking the paper into the shower drain. All of it sort of builds into this really beautiful piece. And again, this story about how you kind of didn't try to hide the fact that there's this seam right down the middle. So when you're going through all of these, what I call experiments, like even all the way back to the real world film project, right, where you were sloughing it off in the shower, it sounds like, for hours, all the way to finding this, less expensive paper that allows the film to simply slide off in a very convenient way. Are you filing all of this information away in your head for perhaps future reference? Like, this is what happened in version 13. I don't need this for now, but maybe at a future project or a future piece, this particular reaction that I'm getting might become useful?
Certainly at that time. But here's the thing, I made those pieces quite a while ago, and now these papers are even the cheap papers are really good papers. So I would have to go through it again. Not as,
Damn technology.
It certainly wouldn't be as intense, but I remember I recreated her in a smaller version, and I kind of had to go through it, but I did find some cheap photographic paper. The thing is the paper and the printers are getting better with the archival links and everything. So I would have to go through. I definitely would practice again. I wouldn't just say, hey, this is going to be a final. But that's fine. That's fine. Some of those practice pieces are pieces of art in their own right.
Absolutely. So. I think they're beautiful. The ones that you've sent, every iteration I've seen of that piece with Zia Menica, it's a uniquely beautiful piece of art. However much we can agree that art mirrors life and life mirrors art, I definitely believe that not all of us are cut out to be actual artists. Both my husband and his brother, David, are real-life artistes. They've spent most of their lives answering first to a creative calling, and more importantly, they have both the talent and the technical expertise to answer that calling in extraordinary ways. Me, despite drilling through Suzuki books for years, I could never play the piano the way Anthony could. But being an artist these days is not just about being good at it. Indeed, as in all walks of life, from lawyers to painters, skill alone won't guarantee a roof over your head or the means to continue doing what you want to do. That said, there's a reason I chose law over creative writing when I graduated college, and I was super curious to hear why David decided to go in a slightly different direction. I wanted to talk a little bit about your decision to become an artist. You talk about sort of what I view as a confidence developing and also heavily confidence reliant process of just the creation of art. I was not joking when I said it sounds terrifying to just trust that, oh, well, somewhere along the line, it'll turn into what I want it to turn into. I completely understand that that takes just years of doing this over and over. I mean, iteration upon iteration to know exactly how the paint is going to dry or what the color is actually going to look like, what layering film over it will, what that process entails. But the reason it's so fascinating to me is because my own background is the exact opposite of yours. I, was put on a path and I was told, hey, there are milestones at every single path. Here's the finish line. You got mile markers every single mile along the way. And it's best for you if you just stay on that path. Then you'll finish with a lovely 401k, a retirement plan. You'll have, predictable paychecks all along the way. And that's why I chose law. That's very much why I chose law, because I didn't want to have to question anything. I didn't want to have any uncertainty. But you, in my view, did something very much akin to what you described the artistic process of, when you're putting a painting together. Not always sure how it's going to end, but part of what gives you joy, it sounds to me, is that uncertainty.
Yeah, well, growing up, my parents put my brother and I through, they kept us involved with a number of activities for my brother. Well, for me and my brother at the time, it was piano. I just retired at the age of 6, and he kept on going to become a professional pianist. But then I got into drums. They kept us involved. But while we were growing up, I remember distinctly watching my mother draw all the time. She was going to a community college, and part of that was her drafting and drawing. And now that I think about it, even her father was just an expert craftsman, not necessarily a person who draws, but he was an expert craftsman. Would build his own home. And my grandmother would be sculpting faces out of apples and turning them into Christmas tree ornaments. So I kind of grew up watching my family create these things and always just be crafty. Then in high school, I found that I wasn't much of a student. It wasn't until,
A student in the traditional sense.
Yeah, academic-wise, for sure. So the art classes just kept me involved to the point by, I think, junior and senior year, I think I had 3 or 4 art classes a day. That was a good chunk of my day. And then the rest would be algebra, chemistry, and so forth. But I found myself being in the art class most of the time. That was my dominant thing. So, when it came to going to college, I ended up looking at like Columbus School of Art and Design. I knew I wanted to look into art. I didn't know what was going to happen with that. So I remember going to Columbus School of Art and Design and looking at that, and the Art Institute of Chicago. But at the time, we had moved from the south suburbs of Illinois, south suburbs of Chicago, to Ohio. And one of the campuses there was Kent State University. So that was because that was a state school. That was one of the schools we visited. And the first thing that I saw when we walked into their art campus was this guy. I think this was summertime, so there was a few people in there for summer school. It was a guy on a computer with these cool graphics on there. And it was the first time I saw like these really cool graphics. I mean, this was like right when the Macintosh came. We owned a PC and never even seen an Apple computer yet. And I saw this whole lab of them, and one guy was on there, and I was like, that's pretty cool. And then when I kept on walking through that art campus, I saw a big easel with these canvases on them, and I saw a guy who was painting. I'm like, this is pretty cool. I liked it more than, say, Columbus School of Art and Design felt a little stodgy to me. I didn't really see anyone working. So I actually didn't necessarily get into art per se. I got into visual communication design because I just loved what I saw. That's what I wanted to do.
And that's more of the graphic design.
That's more of the graphic design. And because I loved illustration in high school, I took illustration up as a double major, but not painting, not fine art, none of that. That didn't come until later. So in the illustration, there would be editorial projects. There would be some on, make it up on your own. There'd be portraitures. And I was still pretty much a realist then. It wasn't until then, after college, I was working as a graphic designer, and I told you I would do those pen and inks, what I can do in a half an hour.
So at the time you were a graphic designer, I just want to make sure that we're kind of on the same page here. It doesn't sound like you were taking commission work. Were you working for a company or?
Yeah. So I was working for an advertising agency as an art director / graphic designer. They cross over.
So it's an artistic but still corporate job.
Yeah, very corporate job. Yeah, you get your 401k, you get your salary.
So it sounds a lot like
you get all the goodies.
The straight path.
Everybody's happy. The parents are happy. And then when that company gets bought out and you're on your own, I meet up with a guy who starts using me as freelance work. That was the equity office, and that company ended up using me, and they still use me to today on all kinds of projects that were non-traditional, from graphic design that involved handwork. Later on, once they found out I was an artist, to paintings, or an artist.
Fine artist, yeah.
Yeah, fine artist, because I still consider graphic design an art to a certain degree. So all of their projects really put a lot of inspiration and exploration in the graphic design department, as well as a lot of hand stuff that turned into fine art. That also then turned into printmaking, which I also consider fine art. And then years into that, through that client, I met a restaurateur who I was doing all the design work, the logos and the menus. And he was hiring a lot of artists to put artwork up in the restaurants, and I was into that, and I told him that. And so on one of the restaurants, I was doing all of the design work for it, and then he had asked me to come on down. He's like, I have a 21-foot frame. Can you fill it?
Wow.
Yeah, that
challenge accepted.
Yeah, that was, and I just said, yeah, of course.
But at that time, had you made a pretty sizable shift from graphic design to being more of a painter and a fine
I guess
artist?
I should preface that with saying I did do a restaurant with a bunch of smaller canvases for him, about 20 of them. So I had been comfortable painting with oils.
But never one of that size.
No, never one that size. That's when I started to go into scale, and that kind of changed a lot, because I had to stretch the canvas myself. Now, luckily, I was able to use his carpenters, but I remember seeing that empty frame, and
not being scared, but excited.
Well, no, I was scared too. But I wanted that job, and after that, I was like, well, man, I can do anything after that one.
That is amazing.
And then I also realized I don't want to stretch my own canvases either, even though I had to for years after that. But then once I found somebody who can do that for me far better, I was like, here you go. But yeah, and then from there on, it was just kind of there was a few more large ones, and then I got recognized for that because they were in public places, and quite frankly, I had to paint them in those locations because they were so big.
So literally, people could see you painting in a restaurant.
Yeah. In fact, it would be
Not while they're eating, hopefully.
No. And that one I was still painting while the restaurant was open. I was painting in the upper banquet room while the bottom part was open. But months before that, it was certainly the wait staff and everybody building the restaurant was there.
To see the process.
Yeah, to see the process. And that ended up happening on quite a few other locations.
That's incredible. David glosses over something that to me would have been a pretty big deal, losing his job when his company got bought out by a larger company. However much we like to believe that once we're in for life or until retirement, it goes to show that nothing is guaranteed in life. However, it turns out that, at least in David's case, it was less about being the collateral damage in an M&A and maybe more about being, well, to David. I actually wanted to go back to something you seem to gloss over, which I think is a pretty pivotal moment, was when I guess the company that you worked for as a graphic designer right out of college, that company was bought out or it was acquired?
Yeah, so the first company was bought out. I was getting really tired when they got bought out. They were bringing in motivational speakers to like talk about how to be profitable, and we were having these meetings like every day on how to be profitable. And I was like, I just want to create stuff for our clients to be profitable. And I remember that motivational speaker going around the room and asking everybody, are you a happy face, a frowny face, this face? And I was just like, this is so, I can't take this anymore.
It's torture.
Yeah, and he talked about, so here's the kicker. And so he talked about not being a quitter and all of that, and I'm totally fine with that, except I caught him smoking downstairs outside of the lobby, and then he was trying to tell people in the room about quitting smoking, and I called him out on that, and that's probably the reason I got called into Human Resources the following Friday. And
so we got the popcorn gallery.
I mean, I really couldn't take it. I mean, these meetings were going on for almost a year, and so I'll just give you some context there. I was just like, oh, okay, and then you'd have to make little videos with your teams. They put you in little teams. And I'm like, I have clients to make work for. So I was really just getting exhausted of that. On top of I knew a lot of people in the industry. But don't get me wrong, I think even right before I got laid off, I was like, they're like, we need to talk to you. I go, oh, is it fine? I'm finally getting that raise kind of thing. So I got let go, and yeah, certainly you have that pit in your stomach for a while. But I knew a lot of successful people. So once I just started reaching out, then again, a really good guy and mentor ended up turning into be a mentor who worked for Equity Group Investments. His name was Peter Solozzi. Started using me on small projects, and those small projects became bigger projects, and then those big projects became huge, consistent projects year after year after year. And I was with them for a very long time, and it was through that guy that I met the restaurateur who he had met. That guy that I mentioned said, oh, well, this guy's he's a guy I use for a lot of my design stuff. You should use him. And then that's how I got introduced to the restaurateur, where I would be doing all the signage and menus and logos. And then that turned into fine art. And then the graphic side of it kind of mixed in with each other. And then there was just kind of a mutual respect for each other and liking of, what could be made or what could we do with this place or what would we put in here. And I was pretty, I'd get really excited about that. I would get bored easy doing the everyday corporate stuff, but I wasn't bored with what could we make today kind of thing.
That's incredible.
And then when you see it like in a finished room, you're like, wow.
What was it like when you saw the finished product, that huge, 21-footer or whatever that the restaurateur commissioned and said, hey, can you fill this frame?
Yeah, that's an incredible experience. And to see it, in a finished room is one. To be done is one feeling. You're like, oh, okay, I'm done with it. Then you go home and you're like, okay, I did this piece. But then you walk into the room, and especially when the room is just bustling with people, just dining, enjoying life, and your artwork is the big backdrop of this environment. Yeah, it's incredibly rewarding.
Is it still in that restaurant today?
It is, yeah. That restaurant is Carnivale.
Ah, we love that restaurant.
Yeah, I think it's 702.
So for those of you who are in Chicago, whether you're visiting or you're here, go to Carnivale. First of all, try and find something to eat. There are plenty of vegan options. We've been there.
Yeah.
And look for this huge piece. Can you maybe describe like what it looks like in case people don't have a chance to watch the video?
Yeah, so this piece is an explosion of flowers and fireworks and just colors, a lot of layers of colors. It really is just inspired by the design of the restaurant. I'm not sure I would have sat at home and made that particular piece because I was painting that piece in that restaurant while the restaurant
such a good
was
point. Yeah.
being built. And there's these florets on all the sconces of the lamps that I was trying to play off of. And it just kind of created itself.
That's beautiful. I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of, I think, well, let me back up here. It sounds to me when you decided, hey, I'm going to stick with this freelance thing, whether it's because you knew you would continue to get bored or tortured, if you will, at the corporate gig, or simply because you were so inspired by the work that you were doing with your mentor, with the restaurateur and future clients, and being able to create, something out of nothing, as you had said earlier. To me, it sounds a lot like entrepreneurship. It sounds like you're basically starting your own business of one, right? That's just you in this situation. And one of the things that I've learned from my very small little, toe in that water is that entrepreneurship is never linear. It's like peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys. Sometimes you'll do really, really well and knock it out of the park. And sometimes you're going to be, in the valley. Which to me, again, sounds a lot like that artistic process. Sometimes you nail it, and sometimes you're like, yeah, actually not there yet. We need to maybe hang back for a couple of weeks, maybe even a few years, and come back to it and see if the perspective has changed enough for you to make something beautiful out of something you originally didn't like as much. Talk a little bit about, the waves, the peaks and valleys of being an artist, particularly a freelance artist who works largely on commission.
Yeah, so one of the benefits of having the design background was that I could always fall back on the graphic design and art direction profession because I didn't want to have to rely on rely on having to create paintings. And I was also I also realized that all of my painting commissions were kind of coming from one group. So I knew that was pretty lucky to have that. So that was a consistent peak for me. It wasn't, the valleys did kind of come in, after 2007, 8, and 9.
After the Great Recession.
Yeah.
It was a valley for pretty much everybody.
Yeah, it trickled down pretty good. The last thing people were buying and or hiring were freelance designers, and artwork certainly was suffering. That was the first one. Then ended up picking back up from there, but there was a lot of, it still is. I'm kind of going on a peak now, but there was definitely roller coaster rides of up and down.
What do you tell yourself when you're in a valley? And I'm saying this mostly because, whether people who are listening are artists or entrepreneurs or even at their corporate job and just going through a tough time, what did you tell yourself to get through the valley to continue to believe that there would be a peak on the other end of it?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure. I just kept on reaching out to the people that were hiring me, letting them know, hey, if you got anything, I'm open, I'm available. I was making stuff, so I was skating by, found making stuff. That was right when even Facebook was starting to to peek its head. There was no Instagram. So I started doing live videos of painting with Facebook, and those were becoming popular. They're harder for me to do now just because of DMCs and all of that. You get taken down quite often because I can't speak to a chat room. I can keep my eye while I'm painting. But that was one thing that helped and kept me creating for sure, because I would see that there was a room full of a couple hundred people hanging out and just saying hi. But yeah, I don't recall telling myself anything other than I got to wake up tomorrow and figure something out. And
so it sounds like it was action, like
yeah,
just continuing to go through the process of creating and, leveraging even technology in your situation, whether it's Facebook and other social media platforms.
Yeah, and that was in regards to painting. I still had freelance jobs coming in. They just weren't coming in
at the rate that,
they weren't coming in at the rate I was used to. That's for sure.
Artists are by no means immune to hustle culture. In my own journey, despite stepping away from big law life, I found that I still have trouble shedding the mentality that lent itself to collecting as many billable hours as I could throughout the year. Every 0.1 hour I spent running, watching TV, having coffee with a non-client or non-potential client, these were 0.1 hours I interrogated by instinct. Am I just wasting revenue generation time? And that habit of interrogation, it didn't evaporate when I became a writer and a podcaster. I wanted to ask David how he grapples with that kind of pressure, if he does at all, and how he continues to show up for his clients, his art, and himself. Earlier, you had talked about how even one piece that's commissioned by a client can take, anywhere from 2 to 3 months. And I know that sometimes you spend 10 to 12 hours in this studio just painting and painting and painting. And yet what I find so remarkable is that you actually still have time to get plenty of sleep. This I know. You run marathons, you cook, you are an avid cyclist, you go to the gym. How do you find time to incorporate some of these other aspects of your life into what some might imagine as an incredibly immersive process as an artist?
Yeah, another good question, because I would say 15 years ago, I was kind of on this sleep 3 hours here, work 3 hours, sleep 3 hours there kind of thing. It actually wasn't until later on where probably when I started running, where that, and for my clients, that actually wasn't going to work out. It wasn't working out for me, so it just kind of naturally progressed. It worked then. For some reason, it was just like I would get some sleep whenever
you're younger.
That's probably a big part of it. I was younger, and I was like, okay, I just did a few hours here, fired off that email. I'll go to the gym. I'm gonna come home, eat. Then I'm gonna sleep another 3 hours, and I'll wake up. And maybe I'll pull a 6-hour session, then I'll sleep 3 hours. It was kind of like whenever I was tired. That doesn't work anymore now. That was kind of a natural transition. Part of that is certainly age. But I think my exercise, even beyond cycling, I think running got really amped. It was getting a lot more serious because I was doing running and weights. And then after the marathon, I was like, okay, I want to run that better. And every year, my schedule would just kind of change. And so what it had become now is just whether it's running, cycling, or weights, sometimes it's a combination of the both, has to be done in the morning. Certainly running or cycling for me almost always has to be done in the morning. Not that I can't deviate from that, I have, but for the most part on a consistent schedule, early morning, that's it. Then get home and then work. Depending on what I would eat first, but depending on what the schedule or deadline is, if there's no hardcore deadline, I pull anywhere from 4 to 9 hours. It just depends on, if I did a smaller canvas and I got one full layer on and it only took me 3 hours, I might call it a day there, then check emails and maybe do a little social media. But in terms of like these bigger pieces, such as the flag, it's 10.5 feet, just getting some paint on there is 8 or 9 hours. Wow. Before I even really start adding my personality to it. But I want that to be done, because if I know I go home I did I crossed over into 2 days, 2 full days, because I realized one day I wasn't going to happen. I don't pull all-nighters anymore. That doesn't work for me. I try to be done with everything between 8:30 and 9:30, and then I still have maybe an hour to do whatever entertainment purposes. As of late, it's maybe watching an hour of whatever show with my mother, and then it's in bed. 10:30, 11 would be considered late. Then up early, so that early is anywhere from 5:30 to 7:30. That's
to
kind
make
of the
sure you work
wake up.
out, get your run in.
Yeah.
I had to jump in here because I'm going through something pretty interesting right now that really relates to this point about how running can require you to take care of your body in a way you might not otherwise do. So I just injured myself a few days ago, and I haven't been able to run at all or really do much physical activity beyond limping around the house. What I found is that when I'm off my fitness routine, I tend to get off many of the other healthy habits I've employed to facilitate my running, like sleeping much later than normal or eating 2 more servings of ice cream than normal. Now, I'm a big believer in doing those things that allow your body to recover from long bouts of disciplined, regimented challenges and thus indulging in ice cream parties every once in a while. But I do think it's consistent with David's experience, which is that when we pick up running or some other fitness activity, you become more motivated to prioritize your body and thus yourself, even at the cost of those hustle culture hours. What you just described sounds to me super regimented. And even if you look around here in your studio, I know I remarked how everything is at a 90-degree angle in the studio. And I feel like you are a walking refutation of this stereotype that artists are messy and disorganized and undisciplined and kind of fly by the seat of your pants. I feel like you're one of the most disciplined, most organized, most neat and germophobic artists I've ever met in my life. But what I love about what you have said a couple of times during our chat is that your artwork is what reveals your personality. The process by which you inject your personality into your artwork. And I definitely see a great deal of precision in a lot of your artwork. But what I also see is something that you described while you were, showing us some of the work here in your studio, which is this, harmonious destruction or harmonious chaos. You've often talked about the destruction that you add to your artwork. Can you describe what you mean by that? And then can you also describe, what part of your personality are you revealing through that process?
Well, let me first address, I do like to get messy, and you kind of have to as a painter. You came in here and I have all the drop cloths rolled up, but when they're down, things do get messy. Now, when it comes to the OCD or my organization, I would attribute that probably through the visual communication design program, which was very, very regimented about when you created, they would have these acetate overlays, and your pen marks, if you were making a square, and if you had to cut an acetate piece, if you went over, you were already knocked down a grade. It had to be perfect with these rapidograph pens. If it was wrong, and that program was a weed out program, so you had to be very precise. If you didn't have the B, you didn't move on to the next level. In fact, I think we started out with a couple hundred people, and our graduating class was 12.
Holy cow!
Yeah, BFA masters people would end up being 12. There might be some fluctuation based on somebody who graduated 5 years or even 6 years. Some master's students would stay on. Now, that's where that comes from. I do like to, I call it, there's a bit of destruction, right? I put these huge layers of paint on. They're not necessarily thick. Sometimes they are, but they're usually multiple thin layers. And then I like to break them apart with other chemicals. There's these chemicals that kind of hate each other. Some work well with each other. I could make them work well, but I like to just break them apart and let them do some of the heavy lifting, because that starts to create an unknown part, and then I need to react to that. And so, and I like the finished outcome. When we went back, we were talking about, I look at the beauty of the architecture of Rome, any of those places where there's, from a distance, you're looking at these ripped up kind of buildings, but from a distance, you see this beautiful color, and they're just kind of, they're old and they're kind of destroyed, but they're still beautiful in a way. And I mentioned, I like the way ivy grows on some of these buildings. That is another layer. That's kind of how I look at a lot of my paintings, for sure. I like to put big layers on, break them up, then react to them. And I'm destroying it, because I'm not just taking that paintbrush like a Da Vinci would. By the way, his work is incredible.
Not to shade Da Vinci.
It's just, yeah, no, I'm not throwing any shade. In fact, it's brilliant, the way he creates colors and all that. It's all with brush strokes. I'm just a little differently. I like to create those same harmonious colors through destroying destroying the paint, kind of let it run into each other and see what happens. And then if I don't like that, then I have to react to it, and then maybe turn the canvas flat, let the paint stop running, or turn it back upside down, let it run the opposite way. Then they start to marry each other. And then I'm able to view that, right? I'm able to just kind of see what's happening.
And then, like you said, react to it.
Then I have to react to it and make what I want it to do. So I let it do what it's going to do, and then I'm going to do what I want to do.
It sounds like a romantic relationship. We're like a conversation. What do you have to say? Well, this is what I have to say.
What is that? A romantic relationship?
It can be. I think some of your most moving and certainly most powerful pieces are portraits. We have a portrait of my Rudy in my home, and not a day goes by when I walk past and I don't feel like crying, because I can see his personality leaping right off the page. It's pretty remarkable. You have a lot of portraits just sitting here. I'm looking at one of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I'm looking at one of your father. Seems to be when he was in his maybe late 20s or early 30s. There's one of George Floyd in your kitchen. What are you trying to say, if at all, with these portraits, these sort of in-your-face faces that are peeking out at you every single day you're sitting here in the studio?
Yeah, it's a lot of those were practice, just to stay practicing to illustrate. Now, I picked those characters, those people, for certain reasons, because they moved me at a certain time. But there's still something I like to do with pen and ink that still feels a little raw on the outside. I like to see some of the pencil marks. And I just like to see if I can capture, it's always kind of in the eyes, except for in Busta Rhymes' case, it might be the lips and or the hair. But I just like to see if I can capture the essence of who that person is on paper. Now, not all of those were free-handed, and some of them are from direct images. But I'm totally fine with that, because when I look at that photograph that I took the George Floyd pen and ink from, when I see that it's hand-done, it just takes on a different meaning for me. And the same would go for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and all of them. That's the reason why sometimes I do a lot of the stuff from somebody else's picture. It's because when I see it done by hand, it just takes on, and you can see brush strokes, you can just see the movement of somebody making a decision with a pencil. And then there's that person that they made the portrait of is moving all together, all at once.
There's that phrase, that very popular phrase, a picture paints 1,000 words. Do you ever feel like some of your artwork says things that you can't say with words, or that you can't say out loud?
Yes, and that's why I'll say no more. You know what it is I don't I try not to define any of my pieces, especially the abstract ones. I mean, they're just kind of, it's what it means to the viewer. They may simply just like red. When they see how I might paint red, they may like it even more, and they can't really describe why. Some of them, they may see it takes on like I do these red abstracts where there's just pops of color. People see different things. Some people see a lot of Asian influence in those, and that's fine. I'm not going to tell them any different whether or not that's what inspired me. That's on the paintings that aren't necessarily referential. The abstract ones, that's what's cool about it.
I think that's really important because I think there are some people who, when they create something, they feel like they have to control how it's also received. So, I'm a poet by background. I write a lot of poetry, and I would say 90% of my poetry is incredibly abstract. Anthony's always saying, I don't know what the fuck you're saying in your poems. And a lot of people have made that comment about my poems. I'm like, that's okay. You don't need to know what I meant when I wrote this. I'm much more interested in how you receive it. How does it make you feel? What does it make you think about? Because I really can't control that aspect of it. I can always control what went into it, like what I put into this particular phrase or this metaphor or this simile or this image here. But at the end of the day, there's no way I can control how it's read, interpreted, or received. But there are some people who feel like they have to really contain the way that a piece of artwork is received by the viewers. I'm hearing from you that maybe part of the joy of you creating artwork, you're talking about that bustling restaurant where people are just enjoying their food while your beautiful artwork is sort of there overlooking all of it, is the fact that you have no control over that.
Yeah. That is all fine if there is a story. If there's a story to be told, I'm all for it. But then that person's still going to interpret it. In fact, I think one of my, certainly early on and now, there's a famous painter, American painter, Andrew Wyeth. I think the title of the piece is Christina's World, but what makes that, and there's this woman kind of crawling towards the house, and she has her legs, but what was great about that piece was that woman was always in a wheelchair, from what I understand, right? So he painted this piece where she's not, and that's great. That's end of story. And then whatever else you take away from that piece, which is just an absolutely beautiful piece, that's awesome. Yes, I don't like to say too much, certainly, about the abstract ones, but I remember early on, even in college, because I was such a realist, there was a couple haters that were like, well, why don't you just take the picture? Well, there's a lot that happens when even if you're painting realism, even on the finished piece, even certainly the watercolor of my father in his military uniform, it does look exactly like the photo. Well, it looks better than the photo, quite frankly. And I love looking at it. But the thing for me was when I was painting it, what was I thinking about of my dad?
What were you thinking about?
That's a lot of things, because that piece took a long time. And I was also thinking about how realistic can I make it just to show off kind of thing, because that was college. But that shouldn't make you not make art. I mean, people look at that and they're like, "Oh, is that a photograph? No, that's a painting. That's an illustration. Wow, that's awesome." So
it's that process.
I love it. And even if I were to freehand draw it, I which is cool too, because it'd be a lot more organic, which I do often as well. I haven't done one of that particular piece. But a lot of times I do. The Busta Rhymes was straight up organic. I just take a pen. The CD was right in front of me. How fast can I see if I can convey this? And sometimes when they don't look exactly like them, they still do. I like that even more. So
I have to ask you, just to kind of close this out. These are probably silly questions that many people have asked you, but is there an artist, dead or alive, who continues to inspire you?
Continues to inspire me. That's a very good question because I don't follow. I would say one that was somebody that I was certainly influenced by would be Jasper Johns. I haven't been following his work that much lately. I've been taking a lot of what I see from certainly well-known artists and then marrying them together. So, Jasper Johns would take a lot of these objects, similar ones that I have in here, and he would also do a lot of printmaking. He would also do a lot of encaustic and newspaper clippings on the background and paint over top of them. And I found the graphic side of his artwork something that totally was relatable to me. Certainly, there's a lot of things about Andy Warhol that I relate to. Current artists living, none that I can name off the top of my head, but I could also name a ton of early on graphic designers like Ivan Shermayeff, Paul Rand, Iko Tanaka, Milton Glaser, because he would do straight up graphic design stuff, logos to type animation for movies. So I was always into all of that. All of those graphic artists did a lot of their work by hand.
That's incredible.
And I think that's what I liked the most.
It's like the Ella Fitzgeralds who, didn't have the...
Everything was done by hand.
Yeah.
So even if you looked at it as graphic art or fine art, it was always fine art to me if it touched the hand. And even if it was a precise thing of color blocks over color blocks, that's how they created their graphics, actually cutting shapes out of paper, putting them places, and then drawing on top of it, and then maybe use the computer. That's kind of what I take across from graphic design to graphic art to the fine art side to all the printmaking kind of things. I like to use them all
together.
Yeah.
As we get close to the conclusion of our chat, I wanted to ask David for advice. Thinking very much of the 18-year-old Joanne who was told that being a music major simply wasn't safe enough. David's advice is, as you probably could guess, pretty direct and to the point, but ultimately turns into a dialectic on what it truly means to be an artist. What do you have to say to a person, young or old, who maybe has been told that they shouldn't be an artist, that art is a dying medium, or that it's just too risky, or even if they haven't been told any of those things, simply have lacked the gumption to start, which, as we talked about at the very beginning, can sometimes be the hardest thing?
Yeah. Do you want to be an artist?
That's a really good question.
I mean, it's like, is this something you've been trying to do and you're not succeeding? And then what does success mean in your mind?
What does success mean to you?
That's a great question because I think it's a little ambiguous because there could be financial success, there is no money, but you just made this piece and you feel a great accomplishment. That is success. You would feel even if you have no money, but that might give you motivation to try and sell it. If you think it's good and you're looking and following at other people and you're like, wow, I made this, I think it's pretty good. Then, well, you have to test it on your family. You got to start there. But certainly if somebody looking to do something is like, is this what you like doing, kind of thing? And how serious are you about wanting to do it?
Do you think you could be a good artist if you didn't like it?
I think I could be a very good craftsman, but maybe not an artist. And the artist part, I think I'm still working on. I think that part just kind of lives with you. It's no real,
There's no finish line?
No. But craftsmanship, however, is something that can be worked on in my mind. I could look at something and tell the way it was made with care, or was made with smarts, was made with education of some sorts, was made with maybe reference to something else, or it was poorly made. But it could still be poorly made, and I might like what they made. But if I don't like what they made and it was poorly made, then there's a problem. Because I think craftsmanship is a big part of things. When I make the canvases, before there's any paint on them, if you flip them and look at the back, they're well made. They are very, very well made. Same, even a graphic, you could talk about a file in graphic design. How clean is that file? It's like people who code websites. How clean is your code? Steve Jobs said, you need to paint the back of the fence kind of thing, that famous quote. It's craftsmanship, which was kind of probably why I started out with realism, and that's where I honed in my craftsmanship. It wasn't until later that I started to explore being an artist. And that's going to live with me for the rest of my life.
Well, I think that was the perfect way to end this podcast. Thank you so much for letting us hang out in your studio.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, this conversation was riveting. Riveting is pretty accurate. I was glued to my stool and could have asked David another hour's worth of questions. Going back to what I mentioned in the very beginning, how much of what you want to say do you save for your art? And by art, I don't necessarily mean a 21-foot mural. It could be the food you make for your family, the clothes you pick out for work, or even the run you go on each morning. As David describes, the bar is so much higher when judging craftsmanship, but there can be something that's a little more inclusive about art, a mode of expressing the inexpressible. Now, one thing I can express is my gratitude for you all listening or watching this week's episode. If you are tuning in via audio, just a reminder again to check out the YouTube video so you can see David's beautiful work. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, leave a comment and a rating below, and share this episode with your friends, your family, your colleagues on social media, or with anyone else you think might be inspired by David's story. Otherwise, until next week, I wish you a lovely and wonderful day.